year of Babylon's king Belshazzar, Daniel had a dream, a vision in his head as he lay on his bed. He wrote the dream down. Here is the beginning of the account. I am Daniel. In the vision I had during the night, I saw the four winds of heaven churning against the great sea. Four giant beasts emerged from the sea, each different from the others. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings. I observed it until its wings were pulled off and it was lifted up from the ground. It was then set on 2 feet like a human being, and it received a human mind. Then I saw another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up, devour much flesh." I kept walking, and suddenly there was another beast, this one like a leopard. On its back, it had 4 wings like bird wings. This beast had 4 heads. Authority was given to it. After this, as I continued to watch this night vision, I saw a 4th beast, terrifying and hideous, with extraordinary power and with massive iron teeth. As it ate and crushed, its feet smashed whatever was left over. It was different from all the other beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. I was staring at the horns when, suddenly, another small horn came up between them. 3 of the earlier horns were ripped out to make room for it. On this new horn were eyes like human eyes and a mouth that bragged and bragged. As I was watching, thrones were raised up. The Ancient One took his seat. His clothes were white like snow. His hair was like a lamb's wool. His throne was made of flame. Its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire flowed out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood ready to serve him. The court sat in session. The scrolls were opened. I kept watching. I watched from the moment the horns started bragging until the beast was killed and its body was destroyed, handed over to be burned with fire. Then the authority of the remaining beasts was brought to an end, but they were given an extension among the living for a set time and season. As I continued to watch this night vision of mine, I suddenly saw one like a human being coming with the heavenly clouds. He came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Rule, glory, and kinship were given to him. All peoples, nations, and languages will serve him. His rule is an everlasting one. It will never pass away. His kingship is indestructible. Now this caused me, Daniel, to worry. My visions disturbed me greatly. The word of the Lord.
Let me get myself together. Okay, so in many ways, I think I should warn you that yesterday I went to a comedy show and I'm feeling punchy. So let's just keep that in mind. So I think it's extra appropriate that we had our tabletop role-playing game group start before we have this reading and this sermon, because really they're cut from some of the same parts of the human cloth. Is that a terrifying metaphor? Whatever, that's the thing we're doing, terrifying metaphors. So we have, in this reading today, we have these 4 beasts, and we have, these very detailed descriptions of what they're doing. We have, these sort of vague references to characters. Are we supposed to know who they are? Where will we learn where they are or who they are? These are all good questions. We have references to this sort of whole, like, even the sort of king of Babylon that is referenced, right? And the particular, that's the empire that this is set during, right? There's a lot of references that we're not going into particularly deeply. I want to tell you, the amount of time humans and biblical scholars, those are the same. Biblical scholars are human. I'm so sorry. the amount of time that a variety of people with different professions have invested in analyzing this text and pulling apart those references is incalculable. There's, when I went to sort of dig into it, the depths of the commentary were very detailed. What I want to tell you now is I'm not going to get into it very much. What I want to talk about today instead is, what is this vision an example of? And how does it fit within the sort of human tradition and the biblical tradition and the Christian tradition? And what does it help us understand about our current world? So, apologies to those who wanted a really detailed analysis. One thing I will say is, if you want to read the rest of Daniel, in there, the sort of heavenly, let's say, interpreter does interpret the dream for Daniel, and you get some level of explanation. There's a lot more that's out there. So if you're really hankering for that, read the rest of Daniel. And there are lots of good commentaries that can sort of pull this apart. I want to talk a little bit about what apocalyptic literature in the Bible and sort of elsewhere or in associated texts is, both like technically and what does this sort of commonly held understanding of apocalypse sort of, how do those two things relate? So pop quiz, because I'm that kind of cool person. What nerds know what the etymology of the word apocalypse is? Any nerds that are Mark?
To reveal.
To reveal, yeah, exactly. So it comes from the Greek, and it means in Greek to reveal or revelation, depending on the sort of tense of the word. And which is why, if you have a copy of the Greek New Testament, the book that we call Revelation is just called Apocalypse. So that's a fun fact. Okay, it's like a little fun. One of the things that is true, though, is that sort of in our commonly held understanding of the world, the word apocalypse is so strongly associated with that apocalypse in Revelation, in that book, that people have this idea that it sort of means something specifically about the end times. What I want to tell you is there's lots of other kinds of literature in the Bible that talk about the end times that are not usually called apocalyptic or apocalypse. There's something very specific about both how this vision in Daniel and about how the book of Revelation are structured. And they're structured as these sort of very creative, imaginative, fantastical visions and dreams, right? That are experiences that this person is having usually. Sometimes they're like a journey that person goes on. And they're like hard for even that person to understand, right? Even in the midst of that culture where all of these sort of like references come from, the person having that experience is like, what is this? This seems weird and terrifying. And that's a key part of what apocalypse is. So there's also this other phase of it that's the interpretation. So that's, as I mentioned, that's the part of this chapter in Daniel that we didn't read. We didn't read the detailed interpretation, and this interpretation happens in all the different biblical apocalypses. The two big ones are the book of Revelation and these pieces of Daniel. And depending on whether or not you consider the Apocrypha part of the Bible or not, there's not a whole lot else. If you do, then there's lots of good apocalypses in the Apocrypha. Weirdly, those words are not connected. But the two major ones are sort of parts of Daniel and then the book of Revelation. And they have these sort of fantastical experiences. So why is this a thing? I think that are several elements that are really common to human experience that we can see in this tradition. I think the first one to call attention to is the fact that, like, our imaginations are super powerful, right? Like, we can't help but have them activated by our experiences in the world around us. And whether that's even just imagining things that we have seen before, or whether that's imagining things that we've never seen in our entire lives, this is like a very important human skill and capacity. And a lot of the things that we imagine can make us scared and afraid, right? They can make us, whether it's sort of like, and just an anxiety about, you're like worried about something that might happen to you when you're like, it's like everybody's like nightmare about like a school test or whatever, or public speaking, right? Where you're like, oh my God, I can see it in my mind happening, right? It's like this disaster. Or whether it's something that you're like not sure could ever come to pass, which is sort of the category that these visions are in, you really still have things that can like prompt a very strong response from our nervous system and from our hearts and minds within us. And because of that capacity, it's something that we as a society, we as a species have needed to address, right? Because it impacts our relationships with one another, with the world. So I think that's like one of the sort of reasons why apocalyptic literature exists, is that our imaginations are going to produce content whether we like it or not. And because our faith, our scripture, has to do with our full humanity, it has to include these experiences as well. Another reason is that there's so much in the world that we do not understand. This vision was written in likely the second or third century BCE, before the Common Era. And at that point, the people who were writing it, they were experiencing they were under the heel of empire in a number of ways. And they didn't know what was coming next. They didn't know whether the path they were on was the right one. And their sense of their own ability to change the course of that history was really limited, right? Now, we know so much more about what is happening all over the world, all throughout human society, a variety of cultures. There's so much more input and content that we're taking in all the time. And sure, a lot of it gives us more understanding about the world around us and connects us with that world and connects us with one another and connects us with God. But it's so complex, and it doesn't point us in one very clear direction, right? There's not a lot of confirmation in the world around us that the path we're on is the right and good path. And so this apocalypse, these kinds of apocalyptic thoughts, they're a way of us acknowledging the limits of what we can possibly know about this world, and what our what our overwhelm point is, and the point at which we want to be able to turn to the sort of heavenly interpreter who's next to us on this journey and be like, can you please explain this? This is not clear to me at all. And I need to know where to go and what to do. And so I think that is another piece of the sort of fundamental human experience that we're really seeing in the person of Daniel. I wanted to make the title of my sermon today that full last line, which I think is even funnier. The one that's like, now this caused me, Daniel, to worry. My visions disturbed me greatly. It's like, no kidding. And so I think, Daniel is having this experience in this reading today, and other, authors of other biblical books, or characters really, in them share this experience. And I think it's one that we share as well. It's certainly one that I share, of looking around me and just being overwhelmed by the situation that I see in the world. Wanting to have the power, the influence to shift things, and knowing that I don't, right? And knowing that I am one sort of particle-sized bit of humanity, right? And yet I fit into this like giant thing. So I think these two human impulses are playing a role. Now, those two things alone don't quite make up apocalyptic literature. There's also, the thing that we associate most with apocalyptic literature is this sort of end times reality, right? Or an explanation or vision of the end times. And that is a key part of apocalyptic literature. And it's a key part of the sort of like apocalyptic experience. Now, it's interesting because sometimes it's like the end times of all times, and sometimes in these apocalypses in scripture, it's just like the end times of a person's life or the end times of particular empires, right? And sure, there's like this supernatural world that's being referenced and involved, but we see even in this piece of Daniel, right, that's saying, the authority of these beasts was taken away, but they were given an extension among the living for a set time and season, right? So we're talking about the end of something, but we're not necessarily talking about the end of everything in any of these cases. I want to just mention, because I think it's useful in the sort of disambiguation function, like on Wikipedia. That I think it's a really useful word to know the word eschatology, right? Which is that word that's about the end times more generally. I think the word apocalypse in sort of like common, common language often gets like substituted for eschatology, which is fine. I'm not trying to say those people are like wrong, they're understood, but I think for us particularly having sort of theological conversations or having biblical conversations, that it's useful for us to be able to distinguish between like any discussion of like the end of the world and these particular kinds of discussions of the end times. Because the other piece that they all include, which honestly is something I struggle with, is this sort of judgment of the wicked, right? This is also something that gets really heavily emphasized culturally and historically about, the book Revelation and John's Revelation, and also these apocalypses in Daniel. But and I don't know, if someone were to ask me to envision what the end of the world would be like, I don't know that judgment would figure so prominently in it. But then I look at the world around me, and there's so many things, so much harm that's being caused, so much, suffering that is in many ways needless or avoidable. And I do think there needs to be some kind of accountability for that. But like, how does that happen? And who's in charge of it? I mean, I definitely don't want it to be me. Although, like, kind of I do. But probably, but like, I'm smart enough to know, like, I shouldn't be put in charge. There's gonna be way too many meetings. I do not want to be treasurer of the apocalypse. Though maybe that is, in fact, my destiny. But I think there's this sense that, like, though we yearn for justice and liberation, though we yearn for a sort of resolution and like overcoming of all of this harm and suffering that we see in the world around us, that we experience in our own lives, that we see in the lives of our loved ones, we know it can't just be us that is bringing that. We can see that we're not able to do it on our own. We need the intervention and support and sort of timeless perspective and involvement of someone, something that has been around sort of everywhere and in everything and from the beginning and at the end, right? There's this sense that our particular location, both as individuals and as a society and community and a species, like, we're just a part of the picture. There's not a way for us to know how exactly to do it. But there's so much longing in us for that. You know, and I think that's the last piece of the sort of like purpose of these apocalyptic visions and revelations, right? Is expressing this yearning for things to be made right, for things to be made whole. And we don't see in the world around us a force that we are sure can do that. You know, it's not to say that we don't think there's any way we can have an impact, but we need the support from God, from this bigger perspective. And my hope is that this vision and the visions of apocalypse and uncertainty and doubt that arise in your own imaginations or are reflected in the various other stories that you encounter in the world, that there's some room in them for that bigger perspective. And I say bigger, but I really also mean like even more detailed, right? It's like all the, from like zoomed out all the way to zoomed in all the way, right? These like things that are beyond our limited finite capacity to understand and perceive and experience the world. So that is my invitation for you about this vision and about apocalypse. And once again, I just want to say, if this vision or these visions or your experience of the world around you worry you or disturb you greatly, you are in very good company. Amen.